course, I am something that I am, of course, you know, going to elaborate more later on. But the background to that actually was that I was writing about multilingualism as an 18, as an SB19 fan, and I think it's in a Philippine Star article that I wrote, something about multilingualism, the role of Bisaya, for example. I think there was some kind of a discussion among the fans about the role of Philippine languages, right? And that was picked up by Alamat, and Alamat came to me and messaged me and said, can we collaborate on this particular music video, on this video, educational video? And I said, why not? All right. And that's, so prior to Alamat actually debuting, I was already somehow given the opportunity to know more about them, to know more about their mission and their vision, and that's the reason why I'm tapping into, their popular, um, cultural practices and music in order to also talk about multilingualism. So this is what Alamat actually, one of the very first, posts of Alamat, because somehow people were saying, wow, kumakanta ang Alamat sa iba't ibang dialect, all right? Alamat, I mean, for those of you who don't understand Tagalog, it means here, wow, someone wrote, wow, Alamat sings in different dialects. And then Alamat wanted to correct that understanding, that thinking. And according to them, paalala. In other words, just for us to know, Bisaya, Kapampangan, Ilocano at iba pa ay hindi mga dialekto, kundi mga wika, lengguwahe din kagaya ng Tagalog. Kaya sa mga interview, lagi naming binabanggit ang wika imbes na dialect. In English, um, Bisaya, Kapampangan, Ilocano, and all other Philippine languages are not dialects. They are languages similar to Tagalog. That is why in our interviews, we always mention that the use of language rather than dialect. So that comes up again and again and again in conversations kasi marami talagang nag insist, right? Mga estudyante, even mga teachers, hindi, dialect lang yan. All right? And that is the reason why I wanted to also, come up with this kind of a conversation. Um, Now, for example, because as what I said, it's not just simply a matter of changing the sentence. Like Philippine languages are dialects, we change them to we change it to Philippine languages are languages. It's not just simply a matter of changing the names or changing the words. All right. As I will show later, there's so much behind these sentences. There's so much behind this thinking that we need to demolish it. We need to understand why these things exist to start with, right? Um, what do you mean by why do people? Because you see, when you're talking about Philippine language, sorry, it's Philippine languages are dialects. That's a typo. Um, it's not just a statement; it is an ideology. All right, and what we mean by ideology, it is actually a framework of thought constructed and held by members of a society to justify or rationalize an existing social order. It is a framework of thought. It is a system of thinking, in other words, all right, that is constructed, that is shared by certain, people in a particular society. So hindi lang siya isang statement, isang, you know, just a very random kind of opinion, but that opinion is grounded in an ideology. It's a framework, a system of thinking. So when you're talking about a framework of thought or a system of thinking, that means galing siya sa isang bagay, galing siya sa isang pag-iisip, all right? Or galing siya sa isang kasaysayan. It comes from a certain history, in other words. And we need to understand, therefore, that in order to, to change the way we think about certain things, like for example, Philippine languages, we need to go back to the source of this thinking, all right? And which is what we're doing. But why is Uh, why did I say Kasmal as a counter text? Well, first and foremost, a counter text is a way of responding to a common or dominant idea. All right? It is to respond to a common or a dominant idea. Ano yung dominant idea na ito? You will find out later on. It does not repeat what most people already believe, but instead it pushes back. It asks, what are we just accepting without thinking? All right? Sasabi ng kanila, ay, sabi ng Google dialects lang. Sabi ng Google, dialects lang. Pero, so what? If sinabi ng Google, sabi ng teacher, dialects lang siya. So, what's the thinking behind it? I think we need to start investigating and actually exploring that kind of thinking, right? What is missing? All right? What's missing in the whole discussion? And as I will do later on, what's missing is the historical context of this thinking, right? Who is not being heard, right? Um, there's so many voices, but who is not being heard? Whose voices are not heard? So when we talk about the counter text, it gives us a different way of seeing, um, you know, especially by questioning what seems normal, right? Parang normal, parang, 'di ba? I mean, I'm aminin natin, some of us here probably came to this conversation, to this talk, thinking na Philippine languages are dialects lang pala. All right? So that's the normal thing. That's the natural thing, and we think it's natural. We think it's not problematic. But a counter text then, you know, changes the way that, the way we think about it. And that's the role of Kasmala basically. Um, so a counter text, therefore, a text becomes a counter text when it challenges common or dominant ideas. All right, points out what is missing or ignored. In other words, in presenting something, presenting a story, it's not a complete story. Whose story was presented, right? It looks at familiar things, but now, therefore, in a new way, right? In other words, it encourages us to question and think again. All right. And that's how I would like us to think of the music video Kasmala, how it encourages us to question and to think again, how it helps us challenge certain dominant and common ideas, not just about language, but about culture, but about identities as well. But I'm pushing this a little bit more because I will be talking about a decolonial countertext. All right. It's not just a countertext that changes the way we think or that helps us, challenge certain dominant ideas, but it's a decolonial one. And what that means is that it just doesn't challenge common ideas, but it also, in a sense, challenges, it also questions the history behind those ideas. Yun yung sinasabi ko kanina. All right. It's just a very random, it's not just a very random statement. Oh, Philippine languages are dialects. Merong kasaysayan. There is history behind those ideas, especially histories of colonialism. And if we don't acknowledge that, we continue to perpetuate certain harmful beliefs in our society now. So it asks, for example, why are some types of knowledge seen as better than others? O bakit sinasabi of Indian Philippine languages are dialects? Bakit hindi Philippine languages are languages? Why is that less of an important statement than the other statement? How did colonial history shape what we think is correct or proper? When you say, oh, tama yan, mali yan, no, even when English, like proper English, correct English, all of these things are nothing, there's nothing natural there. All right, there's nothing natural there. There's systems of thinking behind it, and we need to explore these systems of thinking behind it. So what has been hidden, what's ignored, and or erased. All right. So what I will do is to stop share first. All right. Um, and I'll come back to my slides. But I would like just for us to just look at Kasmala, the music video. All right. In order for us to get an idea of you know, what a counter text actually does. So I already provided you the framework for, at least the basic framework for understanding what a counter text is. It's a text. It could be a music video. It could be, a link, you know, um, a billboard sign, a sign, a poetry, any text for that matter, that challenges our common ideas, our normal beliefs, challenges the way we think about things, all right, and overturns it and provides a different way of thinking, a different way of thinking about culture, a different way of thinking about language, a different way of thinking about identity, for example. So I'd like you to look at those, to watch the music video, and particularly looking at images, because I'll be referring to these images later on, or at least some of them, and see what those images actually tell us about colonialism as well as decoloniality, which is I will explain later on as well. So, please, can you um, play the music video first?
Unang suya pa pa lamang sumingsi sa lignain, nahulog na ako. Ay, 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 yeah. Agaran walang paliwanagan, hindi ko malabanan, nadarama ito. Walang biro ang ganda ng hubog mo, di katakataka na nahulog to. Handa akong sunda ka sa masulog ko, saan pa man tugatog ng ating mundo. Bakit ka ba lakas na dating mo sa akin, natutulungan ang di ko akalain. Puso'y bumubugso, dala ng iwag ang dinudulot mo. Alam mo bang sa'yo yung mahanga, ganda mula ulo hanggang paa. Pwede bang makisuyo sa dalagang marahuyo? Ano bang nais mo ay gagawin? Kaso mahal, talagang kakaiba at nabiyali sa ang ganda. Para bang mundo'y huminto ng dahil sa'yo. Kaso mahal, talagang kakaiba. Di na kailangan ng iba. Ako'y lakas tama sa'yo, ba't ganito? Yeah, tuwing sa kadiwata ako nadangtan. Sa kalayo gusto ka makahampa. Pasensya lang kung medyo nagarekta. Game ka? Oops, wait ah. Makapaniglo ka lupa, di pa nagwikya kang utang. Ako'y naulak sa patibang at di na makawala. Kapanuban ka lang kadayay kunin mo, gikan sa nilhan tunulo. Kaniyaki na pintas, makapantay ka sa agas. Ano tiyong karoy ang hihimon ko? Kasi mahal, talagang kakaiba at nabiyali sa ang ganda. Para bang mundo'y huminto ng dahil sa'yo. Kasi mahal, talagang kakaiba. Di na kailangan pa ng iba. Ako'y lakas tama sa'yo, ba't ganito? Sayro mo yan sabihon. Ay, gari nagbabalik sa liklong. Ikaw lang ang di mapantayan. Kahit sino man, ikaw lang ang di mapantayan. Kahit mahal, talagang kakaiba at nabiyali sa ang ganda. Para bang mundo'y huminto ng dahil sa'yo. Kahit mahal, talagang kakaiba. Di na kailangan ng iba. Ako'y lakas tama sa'yo, ba't ganito? Sa dibdib ko at ibig ko, ikaw lang ang lumatigdig ko. Inayanig mo, ikaw ay humaan sa aking harapan. Nabiganin mo kayo. Ako'y lakas tama sa'yo, ba't ganito? Uulan sa aking partida ko, ginaan ko kasing kasing mo. Mabaako ko na uwi makalabaw. Nasa imo ng tanan, ako'y lakas tama sa'yo, ba't ganito? Kasi mahal.
All right. That's one of the earliest music videos of Alamat. Unfortunately, they are down to six. Other members already went on their separate ways, but there are six of them now. All right, but I still go back to the Kasmala video precisely because of there's just so much rich content there. In fact, um, when I teach that music video, for example, to undergraduate students, to share them with undergraduate students, um, um, it doesn't it doesn't I mean it's not enough to do it to discuss the music video in just one session, in just two sessions or even three sessions. Even I already had to stop and move on to the other sessions or other topics, not other topics, but to other texts, because the the video itself actually is very rich with so many things, with so much content as well. So anyway, so I'd like us to think about, or at least, you know, probably recall some of those images there, but continue first and foremost, with this particular notion of languages or dialects. And the reason why I would like to share this with you is precisely because um, when people insist, like for example, the Kasmala video, for those of you who are probably not aware, there are actually about six or seven Philippine languages there. Not all of these languages actually even we Filipinos would understand, because they are Philippine languages. They are um, they are not mutually intelligible, right? Um, but you actually, in the comment section, you sometimes hear or read some people saying, but they are dialects, right? So to me, instead na, let's say, mainis or magalit, I wanted to find out, so I did a bit of a research. I need to look at the discourses surrounding, when there's a conversation, there's an exchange between this, people who are talking about, who are saying that Philippine languages are dialects. So I wanted to find out why. All right. And there are three things, general things, that they usually explain why Philippine languages are supposed to be dialects, because they're only local languages, because they have limited use, and they are just simply regional, and therefore they are supposed to be dialects. Remember, there's nothing linguistic in the explanation, right? It doesn't, when you say, oh, because they are local only, they have limited use, they are regional, there's nothing in the language that basically explains or that justifies why they are only dialects, right? These are all thinking processes. These are all ideas, biases, in other words. But if you still dig deeper into the conversation, if you still dig deeper into the exchanges, all right, it doesn't stop here as to why they think dialects are Philippine languages are dialects. They begin with saying that they are local, they are limited use, they are regional. But around the conversation, you have also more hidden, but not really, more hidden kinds of discourses around it. For example, nakakatawa. All right. Then hindi lang siya local or limited or regional, it's nakakatawa, meaning funny. All right. And that explains why, some of those funny characters in the media, funny characters online or in the movies usually speak Philippine languages, you know. Um, they also would say, oh, because it's not important. So it's not just simply, okay, it's local, but then they continue by saying, oh, it's not important. All right. So you ask, who says it's not important? Right? Um, Promdi, right? From the province. These, listening to people speaking, let's say I'm an Aklanon, for example, it triggers conversations about the fact that I am from the province. All right? Promdi. And you also have other discourses surrounding it. It's badui, meaning it's old fashioned or it's old, in other words. All right. So you notice here that when people start defining what the Philippine languages as dialects, all right, you notice here they do not explain that linguistically. All right. Linguistically, they explain that in terms of values associated with certain languages. And these values, as what I said, um, are ideological. If you remember earlier, I said an ideology is a framework of thought. So when you're talking about languages, Philippine languages as dialects, look at this screen. This is the framework of thought that governs the thinking of people who believe that Philippine languages are dialects. It's there. All right? Kailangan nating buwagin ito. But bago natin buwagin ito, we need to find out, right? What's behind it? How did it come about? All right? That's why the role of history is very important. All right? We need to historicize it. We can't just simply say, oh, this is the thinking behind it. But where did the thinking come from? All right? We need to look at it historically. So let's look at, for example, some of the images in Kasmala. So you notice there, you have RG, right? I think RG is from Samar, all right? You see him on the right, basically with an anonymous person, a white person, all right, dancing with him, all right. Now, historically, that image actually refers back to this particular image, which was actually real at the time when, of course, the colonizers were supposed to be dancing with, walking with, you know, the Filipinos, or the local people, or the Indios, in other words. But what is behind, the image of RG here would be, let's say, the alphabets in English, in English, basically saying that they were not just simply here to colonize, I mean, to just here to walk with us. They were trying to walk with us in order to teach us their culture, to teach us, that, their education system. And to be able to teach us their education system, they would teach us that one is superior and another is inferior. All right. And that then became, a process of colonization, or at least the process of, internalizing, who we are as Filipinos. Kasi tinuruan tayo in a particular way. Now, what I'm actually trying to explain here is to get us to see, all right, the difference between colonialism and coloniality. All right. So on the left, you have colonialism, meaning at some point in the past, there was colonialism. Something happened. All right. There were certain things and practices during the time of colonialism. All right. Um, and it's one of those was, the one on the left. For example, American teachers teaching local Filipino students, for example, teaching them English, teaching them American culture, American history, and so on and so forth. All right. But the thing is, sometimes people are saying, why are you still talking about colonialism? Colonialism is already a thing of the past. Tapos na yun eh. Right? It's already finished. It has ended. Now, that's very true. All right. That's why we have the term coloniality. All right. So colonialism may have ended. All right. The formal rule, direct rule may have ended, but the thinking, the processes, the ideologies, the beliefs that were present during the time of colonialism are still present today. And that's what you call the coloniality of ideas, the coloniality of practices. Even in the way we teach, even in the things that we do in the classroom, for example, many of these things represent the coloniality of things. All right. So let's try to differentiate these, because we cannot just simply do away with this whole idea of colonialism. True, it's a thing of the past, but it doesn't mean that the systems of thinking are gone. All right, they are still present. In one of the music videos of Alamat, there's one music video entitled Abakada, you know, um, which is about colorism, which is about how Filipinos, and especially indigenous Filipinos, were taught to believe in the fact that they're dark, and they're ugly, and therefore they need to have a certain kind of beauty standard that is supposed to be white, right? As I will also explain to later on. All right? So, yes, tapos na yon sa panahon ng kolonyalismo, but the thinking is still present and the practices are still present. Kahit nga sa mga highways natin, andyan pa yung mga billboards eh. So look at Alas. Alas is from Davao, right? So you notice here, another, like white anonymous person was trying to scrub Alas's skin, all right? So of course, when you're trying to scrub someone's skin, you're trying to um, clean it up, because it's probably um, it looks ugly, it looks dirty, it looks dark. So you need to scrub it in order to look whiter, to look cleaner. All right. So yung itsura pa lang, yung skin pa lang ni Alas supposedly is not enough. He has to be clean because he looks dirty, he looks ugly. Now, it references this particular, not just this particular, image during the time of colonialism. No, this was actually President McKinley, in a in a magazine, for example. And it actually shows there, let me just read it, the Filipinos' first bath. Oh, you dirty boy. So in other words, basically constructing a discourse that Filipinos, in order to be clean, in order to be, to live up to certain Western standards of beauty, for example, they need to have their first bath. All right, they need to be cleaned. So you notice here, the ideas about who is beautiful, who is a superior race is now associated with, colonial infrastructures of control, for example, right? So makikita natin dito here, that during the time of colonialism, and not just, of course, American colonialism, but of course also the time of Spanish colonialism, when there was a hierarchy of races as well, di ba, sa mga peninsulares, insulares, as opposed to the Indios, right? There's a hierarchy of those races, right? But you will see the same thing here. There were certain discourses during the time of colonialism, about the importance of being clean. And if your skin is not white enough, you are dirty. It says there, oh, you dirty boy. All right. Um, Colonialism as the first, as the way to somehow give Filipinos, um, you know, um, a way out, right, of being backward, for example. But this kind of thinking, and you have to be, you bear that in mind, thinking. You look at highways or streets, you have billboards there, products selling pampaputi, selling, whitening products, for example. It feels like it's not harmful, but when people look up to those billboards, many of them start thinking, oh, I am not, you know, beautiful enough. I am not white enough. I need to buy something in order to whiten my skin, in order to make me more confident, and so on and so forth. So it looks not harmful, right? But it actually goes back here, to colonial beginnings of these kinds of thinking. Kaya, yes, again, colonialism might be a thing of the past, but coloniality continues, to influence our thinking and our lives. Now you look at Mo. Mo here is from um, Zambales. And you look here, Mo is unfortunately being shown to really, ito tinatawag na gradations of race eh. So if you notice here where Mo is supposed to be closer, his physical features are supposed to be closer to beasts, to animals, all right? And the more your features are closer to the one on the left, the superior your race is. Now, this is not, a very kind of rare or random kind of thinking. It was actually part of the academic discourse. Anthropology was based on this thinking. Even sociology, for that matter, is based on this thinking. You know, Academic scholarship at the time was based on the thinking that certain races are superior to others because their brains are supposed to be bigger, or and so on and so forth. And that's associated with how they look. So the closer you are to how you look, like on the left, supposedly the more the more superior, the superior you are, as part of the race. So yung sinasabi ko, during those times, it was actually taught. So it says here the varying grades of intelligence. All right? So the closer you are to the left, yung physical features mo, it's associated with intelligence. All right? So if you notice there, you have, you know, intelligence, physical features, color of the skin, the English language. I It doesn't, it's no longer surprising that in social media, when and even in our daily conversations, when people start talking about the English language and they hear someone speak the English language, they say, oh, matalino, right? Right? There's nothing linguistically that says English equals intelligence, or any language equals intelligence. All right? We again draw that kind of ideology from somewhere else. All right? So we need to disentangle that kind of thinking. All right? I mean, I speak English. That doesn't mean because of English I am intelligent. All right? Um, I can speak any other language and still be intelligent. But the problem is, and this is unfortunate, even teachers, even educators think this way. All right? You're smart if you speak a colonial language such as English, but you're not smart because you're not really very good at it. That's not the way it should go, right? And again, that's what I said. I'm showing here that this kind of thinking, all right, goes back historically. And lastly, that's Taneo from let's say he's Ilocano, all right. Um, no, the province just evaded me at this point. So if someone in the comment section can say, but definitely he's Ilocano. All right. So notice here the very first part. He was, he's in a sort of like a bondage, right? Nakagapos siya, right? With eyes looking. I mean, eyes, sad and unfortunate and emotionally disturbed, basically. All right. So it's just probably one of those images, but it actually refers back, all right, to this real image of a Filipino girl, all right, who was, also, parang ginapos din, all right, um, with some of those white people or some of those, Western um, people around. So if you notice the Kasmala video, there's always people, the white, anonymous people surrounding, you know, um, Alamat, all right? So always being looked at through the gaze of the colonizers, for example. Now, I don't have time, of course, to go back to history, but if you want, you know, I'm not sure if you were actually taught in Kasaysayan. I'm not sure if you were actually taught in history, all right, that sometime in, let's say, in the 1900s, early 1900, there was what we call an expo, the St. Louis, expo, in the United States. Many of our tribal indigenous Filipinos were forcibly taken out of their places in the Philippines and brought to St. Louis to somehow be, you know, part of this kind of like a music, no, not music, a zoo, you know, like a human zoo, naging like, um, sources of sources of curiosity, you know, um, and the problem is that many of these were I mean, not the problem, but the main problem was that they were forcibly taken out of the Philippines and brought there. In fact, many of them actually eventually died because they suddenly started to, becoming sick. And many of them also had mental issues. Can you imagine being forcibly out of it and put in this kind of a human zoo where people would look at them? Some of them were actually fed dog food precisely because they think that it's an example of being tribal, being backward, being in the in the old age, Stone Age, for example. All right. But the thing is, yes, there was that, but even until now, nakagapos pa rin. That's what I think Taneo's um, image there tells us. Many of us are still bonded, and I will argue that even this whole thinking about Philippine languages, the way we look at Philippine languages, the way we value Philippine languages, nakagapos pa rin tayo sa kasaysayan natin. All right. So here we're talking about, and I'm talking about the coloniality of our language ideologies. Where did it all come from? All right. So this is just one of those many newspaper headlines at the time of colonialism. It says English ousts dialects from Philippines. So noon pa lang tinuruan na tayo, dialect siya eh. So how do you justify that English should be the main medium of instruction or the sole medium of instruction? You justify it by saying, of course, by telling people, well, your languages are not as important as English. So then Filipinos started to believe that they're not as important as English, right? And even now we're thinking, oh, they're not as important as English, right? And we think that it's the natural way of thinking, right? But if you notice that that kind of thinking actually, you know, goes back many generations ago or many decades ago, all right? And it says, even it's interesting strategically they use the word ousts. It's like a forcible, taking out of those Philippine languages from the Philippine classrooms. And therefore, here we're talking about the coloniality of language ideologies as inequalities of multilingualism. We're talking about the Philippines as a multilingual context, right? As a multilingual country. So when we talk about multilingualism, I'll give you an example because I taught in Singapore. I live in Singapore for 20 years. So I'll probably like give it a, you a, give a bit of a glimpse of in multilingualism in Singapore. All right. So, for example, here are some of the languages in Singapore. You have English, you have Mandarin, you have Malay, and many other languages: Tamil, Hainanese, Hindi, Sindhi, Gujarati, Taucho, Malayalam, Hakka, Urdu, and many other languages, right? So, our initial understanding is the same thing with the Philippines. Is when you talk about multilingualism, you're talking about the distribution of different languages, right? But look here, in reality, this is what happens. There's not just simply a distribution of languages, but there's a hierarchy of languages. Kaya when you're talking about something multilingual, there's always a hierarchy of languages where you have, English is the most dominant, then you have Mandarin and Tamil and Malay. And because of that, decisions about what is correct, who is smart, who is modern, who is contemporary, and so on and so forth, all right? Um, depends on the symbolic power of many of these languages as well, right? So this is what we mean therefore by inequalities of multilingualism, right? We are not just simply talking about multilingualism in Singapore. We're not just simply talking about multilingualism even in Vietnam. We're not just simply talking about multilingualism in the Philippines, all right? We're not just simply talking about multilingualism in many different parts of the world. We're talking about inequalities of multilingualism all the time because these languages, while they are distributed, there are multiple, there are many, they are not treated equal. I have written a lot about Philippine languages as languages, and you can just search online and definitely you can have those references as well. Many have somehow started doing research on this particular area. If you're interested, you can always message me and I can help, somehow, help you design your research, in this particular context. There's so much. The video about, language comparison earlier where I appeared with Alamat, you will, if you check out, it's more than 5,000 comments. You That's by itself, when you do some kind of analysis, a discourse analysis, for example, not even 5,000 comments because that's massive. All right. Even just a segment, a part of those comments can actually constitute already, let's say, a BA undergraduate or even a master's thesis already or a master's dissertation. All right. or a PhD dissertation, depending on where what you call it, right? Um, so much can already be done. You don't need to think so very differently and so hugely, you know, about your own research. Just focus on certain comments, and then you describe and you analyze, you codify, you code, in other words, and you already have fantastic research along these lines, because we need research along this line. So at the end of the day, this is my last one. So notice here, we talk about Kasmal as a decolonial counter text. Yeah, maybe nabasag, right? You notice here, I mean, I wanted to let you see it, because there's something going on there that tells us visually, all right, how a counter text works, all right? Mayroon kayong binabasag, there's something that you are demolishing, there's something that you're destroying. And here we're talking about a system of ideas, a system of thinking, all right, that needs to go away, in other words. So when you talk about Kasmalas, this decolonial text, right? It brings forward voices that have been ignored or pushed aside. You know, voices of those who, we never even learned about it. At least many of us never even heard about, that St. Louis exhibition, where many of our, indigenous Filipinos were actually shipped forcibly to the United States in order for them to be part of a human zoo. All right. Their voices were never part of it. And here you have Kasmala surfacing that and letting us know that there was that part of history, unfortunate history, but we need to, reconcile with the fact that it happened in order for us to do something about it. And it shows how knowledge is connected to power. In other words, this thing about Philippine languages as dialects, that's knowledge according to many of us, but it's connected to power because it did not just simply come out of Google, right? Yun sabi, ito sabi ng Google eh. Itong sabi ng teacher ko. It connected to power because you link it to something broader than or larger than us, which is, of course, historical in nature, going back historical to figure out and to trace how that knowledge was formed to start with. And Kasmala as a countertext, questioning the idea that one way of knowing is the only or best way. So there are many other ways of knowing, all right? And we need to, you know, demolish it and destroy it in order for us to somehow, bring forth a different way of looking at it. And therefore, my last line here, it does not just simply add new voices, right? What it does is it changes how we think about knowledge itself. It changes how we think about what do we know, but do we know, why do we know what we know? All right? Dapat yun parati nating ano no? Hindi lahat ng this is how I understand things. This is what I know. I think the entire presentation is basically telling us, why do we know what we know? And is there something that we need to know, but we still don't know? And why is it that this is what we know? All right. Why is it that what we know is that Philippine languages are dialects? Why don't we know that Philippine languages are languages? And when we ask ourselves these questions, we go back historically, we go back socially, politically, and ideologically to understand that the things that we think about, the things that we believe in, are things that are rooted in history, rooted in politics, rooted in society and culture as well. So with that, maraming salamat. Mayat ayat nga adlaw kinyo nga tanan, that's Aklanon.
That was a beautiful talk from Dr. Ronnie Tupas. Thank you very much, sir, for that very highly engaging and insightful and thought-provoking lecture, of course, with the title Kasmala as Counterattacks, P-pop Multilingualism and Decoloniality. Maraming salamat po, and we truly appreciate your valuable contribution to today's discussion. And at this juncture, we are now open the floor for questions and discussions. To facilitate this segment, may I call on Mr. Ramjan B. Marcos?
Afternoon, everyone. Am I audible? Okay, so thank you so much for that very insightful talk about the Kasmala as a counter text, Dr. Ronnie Tupas. So for 15 minutes, we'll take this time to cater questions from our participants. You may raise your hand to be recognized and directly ask your questions to our speaker, or maybe just type your questions to the chat box for me to read it to our speaker. One, do you have questions? Or maybe I'll start asking our speaker first. So I have prepared a question, Dr. Ronnie Tupas, pertaining about the Kasmal as a counter text. So it came to my mind that although Kasmal is framed as a counter text where we defined earlier that counter text is a response to the dominant or mainstream ideas, could there be limitations in terms of representation since I have observed that many P-pop idols seem to adopt the aesthetics or practices similar to K-pop idols. So could this context be considered as a factor in determining whether the multilingual elements in Kasmala reflect the authentic linguistic practices in the Philippine setting, or are these elements used primarily for uh, to commercialize the P-pop, or in this regard, how are marginalized Philippine languages actually positioned within the P-pop industry?
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say it's an excellent question. All right. And the reason why I say it's an excellent question, and it's because Alamat actually from the very start already, responded to that question. What they're saying, because you see that's a misconception when you're talking about Philippine languages. It's basically like, oh, let's go back to the past. Let's go back to something pure. Let's go back to something local. What actually Alamat is saying, and that is also my stance, is that when you are talking about Philippine languages, for example, we're talking about Philippine cultures and P-pop for that matter, and music for that matter, you are actually engaged in conversations that are beyond the local, meaning the global, for example. So when you look at the aesthetics of Alamat, and I mean, you look at music videos of Alamat, for example, hindi siya, like, di sana magbabahag na lang lahat, di ba? All right. No, they try to marry what's local and what's global. All right. Precisely because that's what realities in society now. We are engaged with, conversations and practices that you cannot just simply say, oh, this is local and that's global. It's a different kind of aesthetics. So you will notice, for example, I mean, I think many of you, hopefully some of you will check out some of their work. It's some of that their aesthetics is recognizably local because it references local histories, for local cultures, but it's also recognizably global because it references what's out there in the world right now. All right. And so what happens here is, as Filipinos actually trying to embrace what's global, ang sinasabi lang naman dito is, huwag kalimutan kung sino tayo. When we try to embrace what is there, huwag kalimutan kung sino tayo. Which is then, in a very literal sense, the response to that in the context of multilingualism is it doesn't mean that you're rejecting English. All right? Multilingualism, and that's how people usually frame multilingualism now, Philippine languages, or even when the mother tongue-based multilingual education. Ano nangyari sa English? All right? But multilingualism, multilingual education, all right, Philippine languages as languages, all of these talk, they are not anti-English. All right. Ang problema nga lang is for us, as what I said, that's why I focus on systems of thinking. All right. So when, for example, when you study English, when you teach your kids, your children, or when you teach your students English, you just don't teach English. You tell them don't study your local languages. They're not important anymore. All right. Pero hindi ba pwede that you can learn English, but at the same time also continue to use and love your own mother tongues and Philippine languages, right? So in other words, hindi dapat sila pinag-aaway-away, all right? And that's what people are basically saying or sometimes to me, I mean, if you increase, if you promote multilingualism, doesn't that bring down, the proficiency of people in the English language? But that's an incredibly problematic assumption. All right. If you look at, for example, um, the top 20 most globally competitive, economically competitive, nations in the world, what do they study in? They study in their mother tongues. The German study in German, the Finnish study in Finnish, the French study in French, the Japanese study in Japanese, the Korean study in Korean. Of course, Americans, kasi English dito sa UK, here in the UK, English is the main language of instruction. All right. The Chinese study in Chinese. All right. Um, and yet they're all more economically advanced. So why are we advancing a certain kind of thinking? All right. That says basically saying, oh, English is enough. Okay, in English, right? The Japanese are learning English too. The French are learning English too. But the thing is that there is that kind of push to learn, to still continue to learn through their own local cultures and language for that matter. So going back to your question, I think it's what I said it's an excellent question. It doesn't mean that we are letting go of the global. It's not an either global or local. All right. It is how do you actually draw on your own Filipino cultures. I say cultures and histories, and traditions, all right? Use them as your base for creating music, for creating visuals and creating optics, and then, incorporate many other visuals around the world. So you're creating something new, something different, all right? Ang problema, and I have to agree though, in a lot of P-pop, aesthetics, there's still sometimes a desire to really, align with the K-pop, ideal. All right. So, but I would like to look at P-pop as a range of different optics, of different visuals, and different kinds of music. And that's what makes P-pop actually very enriching and very exciting because there's something for everyone. All right. If ako, for example, again, you can check out. I wrote about it. I think I'm not sure. It's something in Philippine Star during the time of the pandemic. All right. During the time of the pandemic, one of the things that's made us survive, because we were all stuck inside the house, right? Was OPM, for example. So, my kids were growing up at the time, especially, for example, songs, Go Up ng SB19 and so on. I would, dictate to them the lyrics of the song, all right? Ask them to put them down, write it down, these words, and study them, all right? And then I realized that when we started listening to and watching the music videos, all right, later on also with Alama, and then I realized that since they are more familiar with K-pop, they actually tell me that, actually the music videos are meaningful in so many ways because of the images there. So naging conversation siya for me to start thinking about and teaching them critical thinking, about evaluating things and about evaluating text as well. So I think my point here is there's a range, all right? And there's, always something for everybody. Meron namang ayaw dito, but to me, I encourage everyone. I'm a P-pop stan, in other words. Anyone is a good. representation of P-pop, iba-iba nga lang taste. And that's the beauty behind it. Because Filipino visual is diverse. Tingnan nyo lang actually yung alamat eh. Tingnan nyo lang alamat. Tingnan nyo lang yung Beanie. Tingnan nyo lang yung SB19. Just the visuals. All of them are Filipino, but yet different kind of visuals, different kind of optics. And I think that to me is a teaching point even for my own students.
Okay, so thank you so much for that, Doc Ruan Tupas. So I think Sir Fernand has a question.
Yes, good afternoon and madamo gid nga salamat Dr. Tupas. I don't speak Aknyanon but there's a lot of Hiligaynon here, descendants from Panay
Yeah.
in South
Kabal
Cotabato.
kabal naman ko magilagay nun. Fluent ko magilagay nun.
In fact, damo sa mga tupas diri sa amon nga province. All right. Anyway, my question is about I just had a realization of how deeply rooted and engraved the coloniality is in our classrooms even up to this point, and the battle of decolonializing is still a long way, a long battle pa, no? But for the sake of our foreign participants in the webinar as well, I'd like to get your perspectives about other ASEAN countries, for example, who are at the moment still trying to learn English, and we already know the biases of English varieties that they want to pursue. For example, if you apply as an English teacher in Vietnam, in Thailand, or in Cambodia, and other ASEAN, there's always a bias of non-native speakers and native speakers. What do you think of that, Dr. Tupas? Of course, we
Yeah,
have Vietnamese students here and participants as well.
yeah, actually some of them are studying with me. Um, yeah, and I've already somehow discussed questions of native speakerism. In other words, actually, don't you know that in research, there's actually very little research that shows that when you are a native speaker, you are automatically a better teacher. There's nothing. All right. And yet we believe that, and so on. And another thing is even the notion of the native English teacher or a native speaker, all right? We think we know what it means, but when we start defining what it means, actually we don't know what it means. All right. Sige, try to write down your understanding of the native speaker. Who is the native speaker? And I was just simply in conversation with someone. I don't want to mention the name of the country, but Pinoy siya, but he was also teaching English in another country. And, there, of course, their hiring practices, their hiring policy is to hire native speakers of English. All right. So I said, okay, so I assume, okay, fine. All right. Um, let's not question that decision to hire native speakers of English. All right. And then I asked him, and then he actually mentioned to me, shared with me this experience of because he was part of the hiring process, that there was a native speaker from the United States who is a Black American, and then he said he was not hired. All right. Someone who was hired actually is someone from France who is not, who doesn't speak English as the first language, right? And then he asked why, if indeed, okay, let's say, okay, let's not make any fuss about the fact that your policy is, let's hire a native speaker. Why was he not, hired? And the response was because he was not a real native speaker of English. So that's very harmful. All right. I mean, it's not a linguistic justification, it's a racist justification, right? Because if you are really, okay, let's say, as what I said, let's go by the idea that it's we are talking about the native speaker, whatever it means. But the thing is that we actually still don't understand We don't know. We don't have a firm understanding of what native speaker is. All right. Even here in the UK, you have many different kinds of native English, UK English, varieties as well. But most of these varieties don't count as the variety that is associated with the native speaker as well. All right. So even that alone is problematic. All right. Now, I understand, of course, the power behind and the difficulty behind, these kinds. But I think to me, as teachers and policymakers, I think we need to create certain spaces within our own classroom. All right. Tayo muna. Let's start from us first. All right. What do we think about these things? Because, we cannot just simply be asking questions and, saying, oh, these are problematic when we ourselves believe in these very harmful, kinds of thinking. Let's first and foremost tell ourselves and assume that actually, you know, native speakerism exists. And remember, this is not about anti any speaker. Native speakerism is another system of idea. All right. It's a system of ideas. Sorry, it's ideas. System ideas, meaning you can be anyone. All right. And still profess native speakerism. The idea that whoever the native speaker is superior as an English teacher, as an English speaker, for example. But at the end of the day, what's most important in the global spaces now of communication are comprehensive, are, to become comprehensible. You know, you have, I mean, now, like even in the streets of London, all right, you hear different varieties, hear different accents. And what's important here is you carry on with the conversation, get the communication going, accomplish the tasks, understand each other. You carry each other's burden and responsibility to get that communication going, right? So, at the end of the day, I think what's important is first and foremost, let's start. Let's start from us. All right, change that way of thinking. That's why this is also the way I approach the whole talk. All right, because we cannot change our own classrooms, our own students, our own classmates, our own families, our own schools. If we don't even you know challenge this dominant thinking that are to me thinking and practices that are to me very harmful.
Okay, so another question from Miss Kiara.
Hello, good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, thank you.
Ah, Hello, good afternoon po, Doc Tupas. So, hi again, I'm Kiara, and I'm really amazed and inspired by Alamat's mission to decentralize the Philippines colonial mentality with their songs and yung mga post nila, yung sa Twitter kanina. And with that po, I would like to ask if Alamat's mission, their yung mga ginagawa nila, what they have done, have contributed greatly to the Philippines appreciation for the local languages we have here in the Philippines. And if their yung mga works nila have these contributed nga to the appreciation of Phil and of the Filipino people sa mga local languages, is this apparent na ba in Philippine popular culture, sa mga mainstream na mga videos, sa TikTok, sa mga news, ganun? Or does the Philippines still has a long way to go when it comes to a deeper and more stronger appreciation for local languages, for our own local languages? Yun po.
Yes, yes, thank you. Thank this very much, Kiara. Well, I think if you look at it empirically, I don't think we can, like really like capture the influence of Alamat. And number two, I don't think we can just simply pin down one particular project or one particular group or one particular person or one particular, agenda and make that responsible for, creating a much more embracive culture towards multilingualism. I think all of us should have that kind of a responsibility, right? I can actually, however, if you look at let's say, um, the comment sections, for example. If you look at even the term multilingual, all right. Many years ago, I don't think the term monolingual was very much um, current and part of the conversation. For example, in OPM and PPAP more specifically. But now the conversation seems to be really quite about it, and in other words, it surfaces a lot to the point that somehow it's something that you know um, is in a sense accepted as part of the conversation. Another thing is, of course, like, I mean, increasingly you hear different, you don't hear a lot of resistance. There is still that kind of resistance to music, for example, that incorporates Philippine languages. All right. Early on, there was so much, of that resistance because I think people are not, part of it is like to normalize it. People don't get to hear it, but you know, now I think there's that kind of acceptance to normalizing Philippine languages in the national mainstream, for example. Of course, these regional languages have always been sung in their respective regions, but in terms of mainstreaming them and making them national, meaning being heard by people from different parts of the country, it's still a long way. Ano bang tawag nila doon? Malayo na, pero an that it's we're all already there, but we're not yet there. In other words, I think there's a Tagalog phrase for that, right? So I see bits and of possibilities for that. Even um, probably, I mean, you cannot really link it up explicitly because of Alamat, because I think we have to think of it in terms of a collective effort, you know, to somehow advance the cause of multilingualism. We are definitely a long way to go, right? Kaya nga, ang sabi ko, it's not even the policies themselves yet, but the way of thinking, all right? Because no matter how sophisticated the policy is, all right, no matter how sophisticated the policy is, if teachers continue to think, all right, that these policies don't work, they will not happen. A few years ago, I delivered a plenary talk in one conference in Manila, right? And I think I've already shared this. If you've been to my talks, I already shared it. But for those of you who are listening to me for the first time, you know, there was this experience. I was talking about the same thing, all right? Basically saying that, actually you cannot match languages with intelligence, and it's a historically formed kind of thinking, right? And I provided evidence, I provided research in my plenary talk, all right? So for 1 hour, I was talking about that, this whole idea. Pero unfortunately, when I started walking down the stairs from the stage, one teacher came up to me and said, "Pero sir, nakakabobo naman talaga ang mother tongues." In other words, "Sir, the mother tongues, our first languages, all right, are making us all dumb." All right. So if you have someone who is supposed to implement a multilingual policy, but the thinking is nakakabobo, the thinking is, the mother tongues, the first languages are making us all dumb, then the policy will not work. So these kinds of initiatives, hopefully, are ways for us to start changing the way we think. Because when we start off with what we think, how we think, kaya nga counter-text siya, because we need to challenge current dominant ways of thinking and do something about it, all right? Then there's a high likelihood for certain such policies and practices to change. Sa kanila na yung policies, but the practices that we have in the classrooms, we can do something about them.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Dr. Bus. So we have another question here from Donnell. So he says, "Thank you so much, sir, for your enlightening talk. If Kasmala functions as a countertext that resists dominant linguistic ideologies, what extent can it truly disrupt these ideologies if it still operates within mainstream platforms that are shaped by the same dominant systems it critiques?
Well, I guess the reason why it's supposed to work, like for example, you look at the that's what I said, 5,000 comments, all right? And the reason why, I mean, you have many of those comments basically saying, oh, it's, the first time that I've actually um, heard about these other Philippine languages. And if you also watch, because this is part of my own research, watch the video responses. Di ba meron sa YouTube, people responding to certain new uploads, right? So there were uploads of people, listening to Kasmada, listening to K-Bai, listening to actually the language comparison video, and many of them actually start crying and being emotional because they said it's new to them that they are hearing their own languages, in mainstream national media. And I think to me, you're right about the fact that this is still at the end of at the end of it all. Some people are saying it's still a profit-driven kind of industry. All right, but I think my response to it is that's the reason why I'm actually working with, let's say, groups like Alamat, for example, because if I'm out of that profit-driven industry, I'm in the academe, for example, how can I make that? How can I influence, or at least how can I do something, all right, um, to somehow communicate, you know, these things about, I mean, my own research about inequalities of multilingualism. If you look at that Alamat, you have fans of Alamat, you have Magiliw, you have, P-pop stans, for example, who engage in conversations about Philippine languages, about multilingualism. One of the things that can trigger, for example, the fandom is when somebody says Philippine languages are dialects. Nako, mag-trigger yan buong ano. So, you know, you can do something from within these systems, all right, because from within these systems you can hopefully transform certain ways of thinking and certain ways of doing. In fact, itong conversations na ito, some of the responses to my own like articles on Philippine languages as dialects, as languages, you know some of the fans actually printed them, all right, and distributed them, I mean, to some of the, and during some of their mall shows, for example, or shows of Alamat in different parts of the country. And some of them bring or brought the brochure back to the classrooms, to their teachers. All right? So nagkaroon ng parang bumalik, all right, itong kasing-klaseng conversation, all right. So I think in little ways, there's something that can be done, all right. But as what I said, at itong sinasabi ko, the Alamat multilingual vision should not just simply be a brand, all right. We are still a long way to go if we think of multilingual music, OPM, as a brand. Bakit? Kasi dominantly we are multilingual. But why are we thinking that music that is multilingual is a brand? That's the branding. In fact, if you're talking about OPM, right, original Filipino music, right, it should be multilingual music. Because when you talk about Filipino, we talk about the Philippines, our country, we are essentially a multilingual country. So when we are thinking of like, oh, Alamat is, their branding is multilingualism or multilingual, that's not, to me, um, an indication of, success. What to me is successful is when all people, all music, all, artists, not all the time, casually and normalizes the use of Philippine languages in their music, because after all, the Filipino is multilingual, right? So kung maging brand siya, if it's being multilingual is a brand, it doesn't say much yet about the success of this multilingual agenda, right? It should be, you know, music of everybody because we are multilingual. Thank you.
Okay, so I think this will be our last question for this session, Dr. Rani. So this is from Abigail Grande. She said, "Thank you so much for your informative presentation, sir. I really enjoyed this discussion po because I myself is a fan po ng emerging K-pop music. So in your discussion po, you mentioned that even in multilingual communities, linguistic inequalities still persist. So when we talk about Kasmalan as countertext, it sought to dismantle dominant linguistic ideologies and prevent a further sidelining of other minority languages in the Philippines by representing Tagalog, Ilocano, Kapampangan, Bicolano, Waray, Hiligaynon, Bisaya. However, Philippines is a home to numerous languages. Does this representation po ba sustain the very linguistic inequalities we sought to dismantle by representing only a few? I am fully aware po na these limitations are caused by the limited amount of members and language they know and represent. However, I also think, sir, that some of the languages such as Tagalog was also used to maximize the potential for national market.
Yes, well, excellent point as well, but I guess if we have to look at it literally, then more than 180 languages should be sung, right? I think the multilingual music of Alamat represents is an embrace of multilingualism. All right. And when you talk about the embrace of multilingualism, that means our attitudes towards all the Philippine languages should actually change and should change in terms of acknowledging them as of equal value with everyone else. So it's really a take off point. You see? So hindi lang, what I mean, hindi lang kasmala, hindi lang alamat. Actually, it's only a take off point for conversations. Like, for example, right now, I mean, after this conversation, after this talk, you cannot expect to change the whole thing. But if all of us, like more than 100 of us here, go back to our respective classrooms, to our respective families, begin asking questions about, our own thinking about languages, no matter what those languages are. It doesn't have to be those languages in the music videos of Alamat, but your own languages, all right? That's the point there. You go back there and say, I can still study English and perhaps even Filipino, but let's keep our first language. Let's continue learning our first language. Now, what is sad is that, like, for example, even in my own province, like even among my own um, classmates, in high school, and I guess my wife too, in because my wife is Ilocano, for example, um, parents are telling their children not to learn their first languages or mother tongues, and not just that, actually hating them, like actually reprimanding them, disciplining them for, using the mother tongues or the first languages. So what I think the Kasmala or the Alamat project here, and here not just simply Alamat, in other words, what we are trying to do now here is a change of mindset towards Philippine languages and multilingualism. You can, I mean, you can teach English without teaching, hating your own, right? You can, like, in many different parts of the world, in fact, di ba? Our case is somehow, to me, somehow different. Why is it that way? Why can't, for example, we learn our own local languages, but at the same time also learn English, right? Because we can't do it. In other countries, that's what is happening. But here, okay lang. Okay na yung English lang. All right? And so on. So, yes, you're right about what you mentioned about the fact, in terms of representation. I mean, you are definitely limited by, the mode, but what it actually represents, it's not just the representation of these languages, but the representation of a set of attitudes, a set of approaches to, embracing multilingualism of Philippine languages that will translate to doing that to other languages as well in our country. I mean, Aklanon is not in the music video of Alamat, right? But that doesn't stop me from using Kasmala to use that to promote Alamat and to use that as a way to promote, Aklan among my friends and among students and teachers in the province of Aklan. All right. So that's possible too, because what Alamat represents, in other words, is indeed a kind of representation of a countertext, a counterculture, in other words.
Okay, so thank you so much for that very insightful discussion, Dr. Rowan Tupas. So I think one lesson that we can get from this discussion is that decolonizing something is not all about whose culture is uh dominating or whose culture is being dominated, but I think decolonizing in post-colonial times is all about who's going to survive and who's going to adapt. So to end our session for today, let us award the certificate of appreciation to our speaker.
Thank you so much, Mr. Marcos, for facilitating the discussion, and to all our participants for your thoughtful questions and active engagement. So, at this juncture, we proceed to the awarding of Certificate of Appreciation to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Ruwani Tupaz, in recognition of his invaluable sharing of knowledge and expertise. But before that, allow me to read the citation. Mindanao State University General Santos College of Social Sciences and Humanities, Department of English, in partnership with American English Alumni Association of the Philippines and the Regional English Language Manila. Certificate of Appreciation is proudly presented to Dr. Rowani Tupas in grateful appreciation for sharing his invaluable expertise and insights as the resource speaker during the International Lecture Series on Language Planning and Policies with the theme Diaspora and Transnational Communication in Shaping Language Policy and Multilingual Societies, held via Zoom teleconference given this 21st of March 2026 at Mindanao State University General Santos City. Of course, signed by our English chairperson, Professor Fernan Bilahao, and Professor Mario Aguja, our college dean. Once again, this certificate of appreciation is proudly presented to Dr. Rowani Tupas. Let's give him a virtual round of applause, please.
Maraming salamat. Abogit nga salamat. Kinyo tanan.
Thank you, Guido.
Thank you so much once again, Dr. Rowani. At this moment, let's have the photo opportunity. May I request everyone to please open their cameras? Let's have first, yung nasa first tab natin. Smile lang po tayong lahat. Ayan. 1, 2, 3, smile. Ayan, next po. Smile lang po tayo. Let's 1, 2, 3, smile. Ayan. Third po, smile lang po ulit tayo. 1, 2, 3, smile. There you have it, everyone. Isa pa po. 1, 2, 3, smile. And last one. 1, 2, 3, smile. Ayan. Maraming salamat po Ayun. Maraming salamat po. As we approach the end of our program, we reflect on the meaningful insights shared today, reminding us that the power of language not only as a medium of communication, but also as a tool of transformation and empowerment. So before we conclude, here are a few announcements. So certificate of participation will be sent via email after this event, and kindly accomplish the sign out form in the chat box. We will be given our participants 15 minutes to accomplish our sign out form. And also, I would like to inform everyone that our third session will be on March 25, 2026, 9 a.m. Philippine time via Zoom, together with our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Aryan Makalinga Burlongan. Ayan, stay tuned for our upcoming sessions of the International Lecture Series. On behalf of the organizers, we extend our sincerest gratitude to our speaker, Doc Tupas, of course, facilitators, to our English chairperson, Sir Fernan Bilehao, to all the faculty and staff of English department who manifested their presence this afternoon. We have Sir Jovat J. Montania, and we also have Sir Ramjan Marcos. Maraming salamat po. And to everyone, maraming salamat po. We hope that today's lecture has inspired new perspective and enriched our understanding of language planning and policies. Once again, this has been the International Lecture Series on Language Planning and Policies. Once again, I am Geraldine Daniel, your host, thanking you for your participation. Have a great day ahead, everyone, and stay safe. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, everyone. Doc, are you attending the LSPIC?
No, no, I'm not.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
I will just message you, Doc.
All right.
We have a small token from our region here. Bibigay namin if ever you're in the Philippines, we'll send it to you.
All right.
Just let
Thank
me
you.
know. I'll message you na lang. Thank you,
All
Doc.
Sige.
Thank you, everyone. Congratulations. Thank you, Sir Jovet, Sir Ramjan. Thank you. Sir Romeo, thank you. Nandyan pala si Sir Romeo. Thank you.
Ika-30 ng Enero, Merkules at alas 9 ng umaga nagluwal. Nung dapat ay 14 ng Pebrero, araw yun ng mga puso, kaso para pala yun sa